Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the React Fundamentals Workshop. My name is Ben Alegbadu. I have a link here at the bottom for a setup link. Please follow that link. It has all the directions, all the commands you need to do to get started. So it's important for you to get that done before we actually start working with the code. So, like I said, my name is Ben Alegbadu. I'm a husband, a Christian, and a father of two girls. There in front, that's my youngest daughter, Avery. She is about a year and a quarter or so. In the back is our older daughter, Simone. She's about to be 4 in March. And that's my wife, Rashida. We've been married a little over 7 years. And of course, that's me in the back. We live not here in SoCal, but in the Bay Area in a city called Pittsburgh, California. And that's Pittsburgh without the H. It's confusing all the time. But we live there. Currently, I work at Eventbrite. Hopefully, you've heard of Eventbrite, but if not, we're an online events and ticketing platform where people can post events or buy tickets to events. And I work on our front end platform team. I'm a principal front end engineer with the team, and our team doesn't build any of the end user features. We actually build the platform, the infrastructure, the component library that the rest of the teams use in order to build the awesome features that you end up using when you visit eventbrite.com. So, here's your last chance, okay, to get started, to get set up. So please get set up before we get going, okay? And you can follow that link. It goes to the beginning step, and you'll have it all started. So we're going to be moving quite fast-paced with this workshop. They never told me exactly how long we have, but I know we have somewhere between 3 and 4 hours. Typically, when I've done done this workshop, the minimum time I've had was 4 hours, and now we have a little bit less than that. Usually, it's a full day that we have. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to move with pace throughout this so that we can get through all that we need to get through. So I won't be able to stop, and if you run into any kind of syntax errors or it's not working, I won't be able to really help you with that because we have to get through it. But of course, if you have any questions, please stop me, ask the questions, because more than likely you're not the only person with the question. Other people have the question as well. So I want to make sure that anything that's confusing, anything that I didn't really explain well, that you have answered for you. Okay? So here's the agenda of what we can talk about. Basically, what we're going to be building is a fake email client, a UI of an email client here. So what I want to do is I want us to learn by building a real thing, basically. So we have the first step is we're going to learn some JSX, then we're going to number 2 is not right. We're not going to set up our environment. We're actually going to do components. And then step 3 is lists. Step 4 is an email view. And that will make more sense a little bit later. And so on and so forth. So more than likely, with the time we have, we're just going to get to step 4. It would be really awesome if we could get to step 6 because forms are a bit tricky in React and there's some special handling, but really if we can get to step 4 and you can really understand that concept, we'll be learning about interactivity and handling events and that sort of things. If you can really get that far, you'll know that foundation of React application building, and everything basically builds on top of that, specific use cases on top of that. Okay, and if somehow we can really speed through and get to step 8, that would be mind-blowingly amazing because we can start dealing with APIs, but it's not really specific to React, learning about the Fetch API, but it is something new that most likely haven't used before. Actually, quick question. How many of you here have used React before? Yeah? Most of you are like this? Yeah? Okay, good. I mean, I guess that's why you're here, right? To do this workshop. So we'll be able to cover a lot that you'll be able to use to build your applications. All right, so there are like different ways that people learn, right? I like to learn actually by reading tutorials, online tutorials that I can kind of go at my own pace and stop and go and eat some food if I need to, or follow links that are in there and things like that. So that's kind of how I learn. And then really these kind of live tutorials, these live workshops I use to be able to ask questions or just hear the person talking about it and seeing how they build it, seeing how they develop applications. I find that very helpful. So anyway, the reason I bring that up is because there's kind of two ways this can go for you. You can follow along and just watch what I code, because I'm going to be live coding this app from zero to whatever we get to building. So you can just watch what I do and kind of learn from that, so you're not furiously typing as I'm going and not catching what I do. And then you can kind of do some exercises to see how that works. Or you can code along if you want to. And I'm going to type slow enough and explain what I'm typing so that you can type with it. And some people learn kind of by doing, and they want to be able to manually feel like they built an app themselves. So you can totally do that as well. All right. So whichever way works for you is fine. And basically the workshop is set up that you can mix and match and follow along one step, and then code along for another step. Because all of the steps at the beginning, there's basically like a catch-up commands that you can follow to copy the previous step and then start the workshop from there. So you can, whether you mess up and something wasn't working in step 2 and you want to get a restart in step 3, you can always just copy the previous step. So before we get started, any questions? Any questions that anybody has before we start? Okay, no? Perfect. So what I want to do now is actually want to demo the app for you, so you can kind of see what it is that we're building. Okay? So let me, this is kind of a screenshot of it, so you can kind of see that's an email app with email list on the left and the email view on the right. So let me go ahead, let me get this set up for us. So I am going to toggle my terminal, get that up and running here. So basically, I'm going to go into the end folder here, okay, and I'm going to start the API. So there's a kind of a dummy API server that's running in the background, and have that running. And then in this side, whoa, I don't know what happened there. Let me get that running. Okay, so we're going to go into the end folder as well, and then I'm going to actually start the application. Okay. So the application is going to load in a second, and we can see it. Let me close this. We don't need this right now. And we should be able to see the app running. Okay, here we go. So here's the app. As like I said, it's kind of a fake email client. So I can click on an email, and it shows the view on the right-hand side there. And I can mark it as unread, and then it becomes bolded, and you can see here how if I mark it red, click this button to mark red, the left-hand side updates and the button shows up, so you can see how these things are synced. If I click on one that's unread, becomes unread, I can see the messages, and here in this messages, you can see there's like HTML content because it's this ordered list there, there's like a heading there, so there's all this kind of connection between the list and the email view, so they're kept in sync with kind of specific data. I could even delete an email and then it goes away and the view hides. So there's all that stuff there, and then I can go in here and I can, I guess, send myself an email, but basically you can go in here and type in an email from. We have a title, awesome React workshop, sounds good. Okay, and then we'll say, oh, here is a message that I wanted to send to you. Exclamation points. Okay, and then I send the email, and look, it's at the top, right there. And I can click on it and see my message that I sent. And it has the date, and it has the from, and it's hyperlinked, and all of that goodness. Okay, so that's basically the UI there. So here we can go back to the demo, and that's basically what we wanted for the demo purposes. So we wanted to diagram the component hierarchy before we got started. So everything in React are components. So from the littlest components to a button all the way to the biggest component, the whole entire app. Everything is components inside of components inside of components. Everything is composed. So here on the left, we have our email list component is what I'm calling it, an email list. Those are list of emails. That's a component on the left. And even within that, we have a component which will be our email list item. So it's email list items components within a whole email list component is what we'll build. And even inside that email list item component, we have the email address that's listed right here, the subject, and then some additional buttons that we'll be able to build. And then that's what we have. And then on the right-hand side, we have this email view component. And within that, we have this button bar here of buttons. That can be a component. We have the subject, the from, the date, the message. Those are all inside of the email view. And then over here on the right was that button that launched the email form. It's not shown here in the screenshot, but we'll have that email form component. All right, so we'll have an email list component, which will have email list item components within it. We'll have an email view component, and then an email form component. All that will be within inside of our app. Okay, well, that's it. That's kind of all the pre-stuff. Let's go ahead and get started and start building our app. So what we need to do to get started, if we followed, let's jump in here, follow these steps. So this is where it linked you to. So hopefully you cloned the repo. So then you go into you take the begin folder. You want to copy that and create a folder called workshop. That's where we're going to be developing from this point forward. And then we want to go inside of the workshop folder and then install the dependencies. So there's already a package.json in there. We want to install all the dependencies that we need to run the app, and then we'll start it. So this is all on the GitHub repo. So I am going to do the same. Let me kill the one that I was running. So we're going to go into workshop. I've already cloned it and installed it ahead of time. And then we're going to do yarn start, or it would be npm start if you didn't install yarn. So this is going to run, and and we're going to get a blank page because we actually haven't implemented anything. So I'll wait. Okay, blank page. So that would be a success if you got a blank page. Okay, so let us close this. Let's start building this thing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn about JSX. So JSX is the way that you can basically put your markup. It's like your templating. So in other frameworks, you would create a HTML file, and that would have your template code, and then you would connect your JavaScript with the HTML file. But in React, everything is in JavaScript, even including the markup. So let's do some practicing with that. So we'll go ahead, we'll open up our app.js file there, and you can follow along if you want, or code along if you want, or just take a look. So this is like the simplest form of a component. We're importing React. We're calling this component app, extending for something called pure component, and I'll explain what pure component means a little bit later. And then it has a render method. So every component has a render method because that's actually what's going to be rendered. The reason our app was blank is because we were rendering null, so nothing was being rendered. But now, let's say we go in here, and instead of rendering null, we render a div, and we say hello world inside of that div. There. So we're basically like putting markup into, oh, I should save it. Make sure you save it. We're putting markup into our application. So if I go back to the app, you should see hello world there. Yeah? People got that so far? Okay. Yes.
You need to pass it as a string? Or
No, you don't need to pass it as a string, and I'll explain why that's a good question. So why isn't it a string? So we're actually, yeah, you can see the code while I talk about it. So we're not actually writing out HTML, we're writing out JSX. So it's kind of an XML, HTML-like syntax that actually gets converted into JavaScript. So if I take this code that we just went, and I go to this tool called Babel, and actually I want to go to the REPL. So I go here, and I'm actually like spoiling what I've talked about before. So if you look at hello world, the div hello world actually gets transpiled into react.createElement. The tag is the first element, so we have a div. Then there's the second parameter to create element are the attributes that you want to pass to the div. We don't have any of those yet, but we will. And then the third and further on parameters are the content. So what React actually is just composing a bunch of react.createElement calls, but JSX is just syntax sugar on top of that, so that you can develop your UI more easily. So transpilation, if you're not familiar, it's just basically taking source code from one version to another version. So if you wrote something in ES6, there are transpilers that'll take it to ES5 so it could run in older browsers. Or if you wrote Sass code, it would take your Sass and change it to vanilla CSS. That's transpilation for CSS. So JSX is basically that. You can write your code so it looks like HTML, but it's actually just regular JavaScript code like that. So yeah, go ahead.
so if you wrote that on the right side there, that should work.
Yeah,
as well.
so let's do that. So if I went in here and replaced this with that and got rid of the double semicolon, let's go and add some exclamation points so we know that it's taking what we did. We go to our app, reloaded, and we see all the hello worlds there. So that's actually what gets sent to the browser is the React.create element. We can just write it with the JSX, so it's a little bit easier. And we'll see how much easier it is in a second. So, so we wrote that. Let's go back. So now we can go in here. Let's replace the content here. Let's add. Actually, let me see what I was supposed to do, just to make sure. So let's add some nested JSX in here. So we have this div here. I'm just going to make it so that it's a little bit formatted a little bit nicer. What convention I do, I always wrap JSX in parentheses just so it's like a signal that I'm going into the JSX context. You don't have to wrap it in parentheses, but I tend to just for my visual parsing sake. So we could go in here and we could add a span, and the span could say Sabio LA, maybe. We'll make that like an H1. Yeah, let's make it H1. Okay, and then we could add a paragraph here, and that says we're learning about React today. Something like that. So now we're creating nested markup. So this shouldn't be anything like conceptually. It shouldn't be anything crazy because this is what markup looks like already. Like it's just what markup looks like already. We're just doing it inside of JavaScript. That's the kind of crazy part about it.
Mm-hmm. So if you put a markup on Bootstrap, will the Bootstrap markup work?
It will.
As long as you have the Bootstrap.
If you have Bootstrap code, yeah. So so this is all being inserted into. I guess I can show you that. So if this is all being inserted into this index.html file that is kind of auto-generated from this tool that we're using. So basically, this is the HTML file here. You could add Bootstrap in the head so that you had your CSS include there. So you would have link, rel, Bootstrap stuff there. And then you would just add the classes in the code, which I'll show in a second. So we have this div ID root here, and then there's an index.js file, and that takes our app, it renders our app here into that root. So I didn't necessarily want to get into that part yet. Just wanted to show you some JSX, but if you're curious, that's how that works. So we'll learn about how we can import components and that in a second. So yeah, that was our markup. Let's just make sure that was displaying correctly. And there we go. We have that there. And then we can go in and we can start adding some attributes. So I could add an attribute like class. I want to add a class, but it's class name instead of class. So I could say if I have a styling for heading, or class name equals message. Or if I wanted to add other, I'll go back to the code in a second. If I wanted to add like an input tag, I would say input type equals text. I would say value equals foo, maybe, and placeholder equals hello. So that's kind of how you do attributes. So similarly, it's just like how HTML works, so it's not too crazy. The only thing that are different is that instead of doing class, it's class name. And if I had a label here to associate a label with the input. So let's say I gave this input an ID of bar, and I wanted to associate this label with it. Label text. The attribute normally in HTML would be 4 to associate this label with this input, but in React it's HTML4. So, and I'll explain why that is in a second, but let's take a look at the app. So the 4 attribute basically means when I click on this, it gives focus to the field. And we still have our placeholder text there. Not classes. So if I inspect this now, we'll see that the class, you can, let me see if I can make that bigger, this bigger. There we go. You can see that the class is heading the class's message. So I put class name, but in the end, the HTML has class. I put HTML4, but in the end, it's 4. So the reason for that can be explained if I take all of this markup here, all of this JSX. I shouldn't really call it markup, but I may say that on accident. If I take all of this and I paste it, you'll see that we had this kind of nested chain of React.create elements. So here we have the containing div that didn't have any attributes. Let's say I put something on it. Let's say I put a data attribute. Data test equals hello, let's say. So we have this div. Its attributes. So one attribute, it's an object, so it has data test equals hello there. Then the rest of the content, or the third parameter and fourth parameter and fifth parameter and so on, are whatever content is inside of that div. So we have 3 elements, right? We have this h1, we have this p, we have this label, we have an input. So that corresponds with these React.create elements. So React.create element h1, p, label, and input.
So what if it's multiple attributes?
What if it's multiple attributes? Okay. So if we put on this h1 class name and what's another attribute that you would put on a h1? Let's just call another data test. Okay. So the attributes are just an object, so it just puts more things inside that object there. So we have class name and data test there. And then we can see that the content is Sabio LA. So when React first came out, JSX didn't exist. So this is actually how you had to build the UI. You had to write you had to write your code like this. And this on the right, I would argue, was a lot less friendly than this on the left. A lot less approachable. So JSX, again, it's just like syntax sugar. It's just a way to easily write what's really happening on the right-hand side there. So, and then, so the reason why it's called class name is because what React ends up doing is it ends up taking these attributes, creating a DOM element in the HTML, a p tag element, and then sending all of these this object and setting those properties on the object. And historically, HTML DOM objects, if you did a document.get element by ID of a p tag, and you wanted to set the class, you would say .class name to get the class name or to set the class name. So that's also why it's the same way in React. Same with HTML4. Because back in the day, for and class were reserved words and they couldn't be properties of objects. That's no longer the case, but that's the history behind it. So that's JSX. One last thing, actually. So let's say you had a variable, const thing equals, I'll make it say something, greeting equals hello, let's say. So we're creating a variable there, and we actually want to put that variable in the markup. We can go here, let's replace this label text. If you want to put something in the code, a variable in the code, you just wrap it in curly braces, like that. So technically, anything can go in here. It's an expression, basically. So you could, instead of having a variable here like we did, I could say 1 plus 2, because that's an expression. I could say greeting plus exclamation points, because that's concatenation. That's also an expression. Basically, I could call a method inside of here. I could call a function inside of here. It can do whatever, basically. You can just put an expression there. So curly braces, yes. Question.
So when people usually write, or what I've seen, they usually write React code, they use component instead of pure component. What's the difference?
Oh, yes. So normally component is the default. Pure component is an optimization, so it can give you some performance benefits. I can't explain those performance benefits yet. When we get to step 4 and we start talking more about state, then I'll be able to explain better what it does for you. But I like to do pure component by default because it gives you performance benefits by default to use it. But I'll explain it. And if I don't, please remind me. Because I always say that and then I always forget. So remind me if I don't explain it. So just last thing, we'll go here. We'll look at it here, and then this is what it looks like. Okay, so that's about it with JSX. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start building out the actual skeleton of the app. So if you're following along, coding along, I'm basically just going to copy this entire thing here. It's the skeleton. What did I just do? It's the skeleton of our app. This is on. So this is on GitHub. This is under the step 1 folder. So if you click on the folder, and it's just inside the README of that, and we've been following these tasks. So this would have been the exercise that I would have said, hey, you go do this exercise. But since we have, I want to spend our time doing more things. So I'm going to copy that and replace the whole component with that. So if we look at it real quick, we have the app, which is a main tag, HTML5 main tag. Then we have this email list, which is a UL, and then it has some LIs, which are the email list items. So we just have some dummy emails that we've received with emails and subjects. Then we have the email view where we're going to put the contents of a selected email at some point. And then we have the email form where we're going to add UI to build the form. So if you look at it, it should look something like this. Yep, has anybody got that going? Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's just jump into number 2. Let's start talking about components. Oh yeah, one other thing. So at the bottom of all the steps, I have a bunch of resources that I highly suggest you take a look at. Most of them will link to React documentation or React guides within React. So this rendering elements one, introducing JSX in depth. They're all, and actually this React without JSX. Those four are all on the React docs. So if you're interested, really excited about learning more about React, highly suggest you read all of those. And hopefully they'll make more sense, or you'll be able to understand it better because of what we just talked about. And that's a link to that Babel REPL that will allow you to file your code. Okay, so step 2. Let's talk about that. Step 2, we're talking about components. So like I said, React is just building components on top of each other. It lets you split out your UI so that you're not having everything in this one big thing, this one big entity. So that's what we're going to focus on today and see how we can use multiple components. So if you wanted to jump right in, like I was saying, you can kill your workshop folder, copy over the previous step, 01-JSX, name it workshop, go in there to that workshop folder, install the dependencies, hopefully that won't take too long, and then start the app. So every step is going to have those steps to restart. So if you all of a sudden just jump in, you should be able to catch up with us. So you can follow that. Okay, so here's what we're going to do in here. So the app already, if we look at it, is pretty big, right? There's a lot of things going on with it, and it's like not even doing anything, all of this markup. So what we're going to start doing is splitting it up into multiple components, those components that I was talking about. So we're going to create an email list component, an email view component, and an email form component to break up the app that way. So this one is already conveniently labeled email list. So I'll copy the whole UL. Whoa, there. Not copy, but cut. Cut it out of there. Going to create a new component. Call it email list. It extends pure component there. And then all components have a render method that React expects and will call on your component. And then we are going to return some JSX, and we'll return that whole UL thing that I just cut and is improperly indented there. So that's the email list component that's there. And then the way that we reference it back in the app is we just call it email list. That's how you reference it. So it just looks just like HTML. We just created our own component. So it's not HTML. I want to keep saying that it's not HTML.
Scrolling up, please.
So this whole thing is, if you follow it on the GitHub, you should see it there. But yeah, that's what it looks like. So I should be able to save this. Go to the app, and it actually should look the exact same, which it does. So that's a good sign. Haven't messed up yet. So we can do the same thing for the other ones, the email view and the email form. So go here, create a class, call it email view. It extends pure component, and it has a render method, and then we're going to return some JSX. And that JSX we're going to return is just this. It's a little bit smaller. So that div class name email view that content. And then again, we can see this both in the same view. The way I reference it is email view, like that. So the way that React knows whether or not this is going to be a normal HTML tag or a custom component you created is that the components you create have to start with a capital letter. So if I wrote email view in lowercase, it's actually going to just write that out as HTML email view, and then that won't exist, so nothing will get rendered in the DOM. But if I put email view to capital, then it knows that that component was created up there. Yeah? And then, obviously, the last one. So I should actually mention now that there are two ways that you can define components in React. This class style that we've seen so far, or you can use a functional style. So I'll do the functional style for the email form. So I could say const email form. So and this time it's a function. So I'm going to use an arrow function like that. Oh, I should also say, so I have these, I guess, ligatures or whatever you call them, installed in Visual Studio Code. So like this is an equal sign and a greater than, but it turns it into a nice little arrow for me. So I like it, but it's probably super confusing for you. 'Cause you're like, how do I get that arrow sign? What? So yeah. Yeah. So it's just an equal sign and a greater than next to each other, but just without the space in it.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're going to be more like that, and I'll make sure to mention that. And then, so this is going to then return JSX. So I'll cut that, call this email form, whoops, email form, and then paste that there.
You don't have to render?
So the function basically is render. So all this is just a function that renders. So we're going to learn that we want to maintain state later and have callback functions. Like this style can only just render markup. So it's for what they call dumb components that just render out markup. So there's a school of thought that you should make your components always like this by default. And then if you need to use more advanced things, convert it into the class style that we see up here, which is fine. Like that's totally viable. Or just always use the class version. So this one's obviously less verbose, right? Not having to do the class. And the arrow function by default is a non-pure component. It extends from component when they create it for you, when React creates it for you. But these are the two different styles of components, so it's good to know. Yes.
Is there any noticeable difference in like compile time or anything like that when you use one versus another?
I had heard some things that the functional one was actually a little bit slower because of basically they have to convert it to the class style for various reasons. So, but it's like not noticeably or anything like that. So don't have to worry about it. So we have that style. I'm actually going to convert this back to the class style because later we're going to do some things that would make the functional style not work.
How do you put the email form? Is it the same as the email?
Yes, it's the same as the other ones. So I'll just quickly write that out. So class email form extends pure component render return, and I'm returning this. So I'll leave that there, comment that out. But okay, so I'm gonna quickly go to the view, the same. Great. So the nice thing about this setup is that if you look at app, you can now say, hey, app is composed of an email list component, an email view component, email form component. It's like very easy to see that now, whereas before, it was composed of those things before, but it wasn't easy to see it with like a whole bunch of markup inside of there. So that's kind of the value of building components. But then, actually, if we go up here to the email list, we'll see that email list is actually composed of these email list items, right? So it has even a lot more markup. There's 5 of those things. So we can actually create email list item, and that extends pure component again, right? We'll have a render, and let's say I'm going to copy this for a second. Return. Okay. There. So, and then I could go in here. So what I did was I just copied it, pasted it in there. And this is email list item. So basically the same thing we've done before. And I could go in here and replace this with email list item. And it will be what we've done before. But now we can quickly see that email list items are dynamic, right? The content in this email list item is different from the one we just copied, and this one is different, and so forth, right? So we need email list item to be configurable, and we do that with something that are called props. So we can define the props for this component. So let me jump down to this. So every component gets an object that's assigned to it that is called props. So this dot props. So I want to have 2 props in here. I want to have to and subject. So this is ES6, if you're not familiar, destructuring. This code right here, for those who are not familiar, is the same as saying let 2 equal this dot props dot 2, and let subject equal this dot props dot subject. So this line, one line here is the same as doing that line. Because the names are the same, the variable and the property inside of it, you can just pull it out. So let's say we learned that we put variables in that way. So we put 2 there, and we'll put subject there. And I'm going to comment this out, otherwise it won't work. So now we're saying our email list item takes in a property called to and a property called subject. And then down here in email list item, I can just pass those 2 in. Oh man, I got rid of them. Okay, I'm going to copy it from over here and explain it. So we replaced this email list item with this email list item. So we pass in the props as attributes. So now, I named it from. Whoops. That was supposed to be from. Okay. So with email list item, we have from, which is this email, and then subject, which is that, and then those get passed in by React into this dot props. We get from and subject out of that object when we're rendering, and then we put it into the UI that way. Okay. So I'm gonna go to the browser, make sure it works, and then we'll come back. What does that say? Unexpected token. So every time I make a mistake, this is for you to learn and to understand, right? How to debug these situations.
Is
Yeah.
it going to be inside render?
Yes. See? And this was for you. I promise. I promise. That was supposed to be inside here. See, you're going to do that one time. You're going to be like, you know what? In that workshop, Ben did it, and that was the solution. So, yeah, it's supposed to be in render. I don't know why I was outside of render. That was an accident. There we go. Okay, so it looks correct. Yeah, so because you can't access this.props outside of it, and you can't really do anything outside of methods like that. So those are our variables for the component, and that's how you make like parameterized components, configurable components. So then we would go and do the same thing for the other ones. I don't feel like typing all of that, so I'm going to copy it. So it's all here in here on the GitHub. So I'm just going to go and copy the example. So we basically replaced that kind of static markup with calling components. So email list item from subject, and pass those in that way. So now our component hierarchy, we have an email list item. An email list has one or more, or I guess 0 or more email list items there. We have an email view component, an email form component, and then the email list, email view, email form are inside of the app component. And by convention, your app is named app in React, and that's kind of the starting point. And that's why it's exported in a file called app. So,
So if you change the name, you also have to change the name of the JS file?
you don't. So if it's a convention that the name of the component and the name of the file are the same, because like you would go crazy if they're different and be totally confused. But you don't have to have them the same. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. So let's talk about that. So remember this functional form of email form that we had? So if we wanted our email list item to be like that, since it actually has parameters, we could say const email list item. So it's again going to be an arrow function, but so it takes in 2 props, from and subject. Actually, hold on. Let me not go too crazy with ES6. So it takes in props as a parameter. And then you can return your JSX here. And then once again, say let from subject equals props. I'm going to comment this out, and then we can look at it. Okay, so this is the functional form. So a functional form takes as the first argument props, the object, and then you have to just return the markup that you want to return. So if you were feeling fancy, if you're feeling comfortable with ES6, instead of this, you would just do it here in the function header. So you never have the props object, you just destructure it immediately and have it there. So ESX and React go very well together. If you see React code, you're most likely going to see a lot of ESX in it. This is how I would write it from scratch. Um, Actually, I wouldn't even write it like this. So since all I'm doing is just returning markup and not doing anything else, it's a basically implicit return. So I could get rid of the return and write it like that. So it just immediately returns. Like there's no statements inside of it, so it's just a one-line return. So you just write it like that. So that's if you're doing the functional one. Let me just make sure that what I'm telling you actually works. Yes, it does. So that's how you could write it. Email list item. So you can see that, right, like this is 6 lines, and this is more than 6 lines of code. So you can see why it's people like writing that by default. Okay. So I'm going to undo that. That was just FYI. What you can do now, so you have these props, or yeah, you have these props that are being passed in. You can define a contract or an API for the React component to kind of tell people what props this component accepts. Instead of just having to like hunt inside of the render to see what it accepts. So those are called prop types. So you would say static prop types. And it's like an implicit static property on the class that React looks for. So static prop types. And actually, let us go to this page on React. If you Google React prop types, you'll be taken here. And it has a list of all the prop types that it supports. So you import from this library called prop types. And then you can have an array, prop type, Boolean, function, number, object, string. And you can have some more fancy ones, like an instance of a class. It's one of these values, so it's like an enumeration for use to that. It can be one of these types, so it can be a string, a number, or something else. An array of these types of types, so you can get pretty fancy with it. So we have what, from and subject. So first, actually, let's import prop types from prop types, and this was already in the package.json already there when you installed it, so you've already got it there. And we have from, and we say, oh, this is a string, so we say prop types that string, and we say subject, oh, this is prop types that string. And you know what? We're going to make both of these required. So you can just say is required. You can add to the end of it. Is required. So that's the contract, basically.
What's the static word?
So static means that. So have you ever used like the math library and done math.random or math.pow? Pow is a static method of the math class. So you don't say new math to get an instance to call it, you say math.pow. So that's what static properties are. Versus render is not static. You actually React ends up creating an instance of the class to call render on it for you.
Kind of like the static keyword in C#.
So it's like static in other languages.
Yeah.
Second follow-up question.
Mhm.
I'm not really clear on what the prop types are. Is it a way of like creating a format or like restricting types?
Yeah, so and down here, right, we're rendering out from and subject. It basically allows us to have types for what the prop should be.
So
But-
if we sent an integer value to this string required, what would happen? We get an error.
So to the from, let's say,
Yeah.
let's try it out. So if we instead of passing a string, passed an integer there. And it would work. But
So it's not. So
you get a warning.
Okay.
And the warning says, invalid prop from of type number supplied to email list item. It expected a string. And then it tells you where it happened. So it's not going to throw errors for you, but yeah, it will warn you that you're doing it wrong. So when you develop in React, you probably should have your console open. Similarly, if I went here and didn't specify it, because I said it was required, right? Then when this reloads, did I save it? Yes. It says from is marked as required and email list item, but its value is undefined. So you didn't specify it. So prop types help with that.
But it's not gonna throw an error.
It's not going to throw an error. It'll work. I mean, unless your code was really expecting it to be a string and tried to do something to it, then that would cause an error. But React would actually pass it through. There. Any other questions? Making sense? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Want to get these kind of foundational things understanding, then we can build on top of those. So the exercise is to move the components into their own files. So right now we have all the components in this one app.js. They're kind of like helper components inside of it. But even that's kind of crazy because then you could have tons of components in one file. So typically you have one file per like substantial component. And each one of these will be substantial components. So here we have an example for email. So basically we're moving all of them into their own files. So normally I would break out, let's see, we've been doing this for like an hour. I'll let you break out and do it yourself. So the exercise, I'll give you 10 minutes. The exercise is to put all of the files. So you have email list item, email list, email view, and email form. Put them all into their own files with the same name, and you would export default each one of them so that they're exported properly. And then you would import them. Like an email list item was in its own file, an email list, you import it that way. So yeah, let's do that. And at 7:50, we'll reconvene, and I'll do it real quickly to see how you did. Okay, so I'm going to do the exercises that we just did, and you can compare and make sure you did it right and such. So I'm going to create a inside of source components. We already have the CSS files there, so that was kind of a hint for you. So I'll create email list.js. I'll create email form.js. We'll create email view.js and email list item. And then email list item.js. Okay. So what file is this? So this is email list. I'm going to close these ones. So this is email. Let me start with email list item actually. That's like the based one. Okay, so email list item. We have the class. I can cut it from there, paste it in here. Email list item. We have to make sure that we import React in pure component from React. Otherwise, things won't work. So even though we're not using React in here, it's implicitly there because of React.create element from the JSX. And then we were importing prop types. So we got the prop types there. Okay, and then to make sure we can use it elsewhere, we have to export it. And we typically export it as the default class so that inside of email list, where we can import email list item from email list item. Then I could take the email list class that was here, cut that, export default the class. Yep, you have it there. Take the email view and do the same thing. So export default there. Import React. We're not importing any other components, so we're good on that front. And then the last part is the email form. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of all of this. Email form, not that email form. This one. Okay, so we have it, exported it. So we have all those files exported. Email list uses email list item. So all that app needs is email list for email list from components, email list. I have a lot of extensions in Visual Studio Code. Email view from components, email view, and then email form components, email form. So now we've kind of like properly separated out the different logical components. So if I did everything right, we'll have our same similar looking application. But now, one last thing. So I mentioned in the GitHub thing about using React developer tools. So those are super handy for debugging what's going on with your React application. It is available in Chrome and in Firefox. As far as I know, I don't think there's any other browser support yet, but it's there for those. There is a tool. So those are developer tools. It checks to see if the page is running React, and then we can see our component hierarchy here. So there's the app, there's the elements, and then there's our email list, email view, email form, and it highlights on the left those things. If I go into the email list item, for instance, I can see the props that I'm passing in, so from and subject there. So very handy, and when we're doing more sophisticated things, we'll see even more stuff that it helps with. So, and I can inspect it normally. No, yeah, inspect it normally. So now I'm on this span, and if I go to React, it'll have that span open, and you can debug from there. So pretty cool stuff. Okay, so that was components. So that's like everything is a component. So if you have any questions about components or props, please ask right now. Yeah.
Yeah, like online, I see some people mention the different types of components, the presentation components and the container components.
Correct. Yes. So
Sure.
container components versus presentational ones, or dumb versus smart. So dumb or presentational components are just components that take in the props and render out the props in some way or fashion. So they're not connected to your application state, or they don't maintain state or anything like that. So that's kind of the idea behind those. So usually if you're making a component library, it's filled with a bunch of presentational components that you just configure it and however it's configured, and then it renders out. But if you have application state, like basically in the future we're going to have application state, which is the list of emails that we want to render, that is going to be stored in a component, and that component would be a container component because it actually has application data. So there's that separation between the two types of components. The idea is you want to make as many things dumb components so that they can be reused in different situations and not tied to the application data or the API response that it got back. And then have a couple of components, a few components, a far less amount of components that are container components. So that's the idea behind that. And we'll start creating container components in a second. Cool. Okay, let's talk about lists. So step 3, we're looking at lists. And if you want to restart again, here are the directions for restarting to catch up. So right now we have this in our email list. We have these static 5 elements, right? And they're just written from markup. And typically your app is not going to be like this, right? It's going to have some sort of data that's going to be rendering out the list. You're not going to just know the 5 things that are there. So how do you render out lists is the question. So what we want to do, or what I want to do, is pull out the data that's sitting inside of these email list items, all of these from and subjects, just pull it out into an array to kind of simulate getting real data. Okay, so you can copy that. I'm going to copy it just to save time. So we have that here. So that's our email list constant. It's still static, right? It's still 5 specific elements, but it's going to get us towards where we want to go. So the question is, how do we render out this array and not do this? So the way that you render out arrays in React is that you render out arrays of components. So you need to be able to transform your array of data into arrays of components. So we saw before that you put things in curly brackets, right? You put expressions in there. You can put strings or variables or whatever. Well, if you put an array there and it's an array of components, React will render it out. So let's say, let me see what I named this thing. Yeah. So we want to create a variable called email components. And we want to map over it. Just use map in JavaScript over arrays. Yeah, hopefully you have. So map takes a function, and the function is called with the each element of the array. And then you're supposed to return what the mapped version or the transformed version or the different version of this back. and then you'll get an array of email components. So basically, we want to return email list items. So we're basically transforming the raw data into email list item components. So we see here that inside of email, we have ID, from, and subject. So let's get that data out of there. So we're getting the properties out of each email. So email, the variable, is basically one of these data objects. And then what we have to do is just pass that through. And now we have an array of email components. But if you look at the code, actually we have LIs that are surrounding each email list item. So let's...
So is the reason you didn't put the LIs inside the email list item?
is a reason that makes sense later, unfortunately, with the markup. So it doesn't make... You would probably just do the email list items and have that inside the LIs, but it makes more sense, yeah, later, fortunately. What am I doing? Yes, it does. Sorry. Yes, it does need to be in render.
Good job.
Yes, sorry. So it needs to be in render. Everything needs to be in render. We're not doing any of the other methods yet. So, and that needs to be emails there. So we have email components. It's a map of emails, the raw data, into LIs with email list items inside of it. So now we have this email components array. We can basically get rid of all of these LIs that are here and replace it with email components. So typically, I know in Angular you have like ng repeat, right? Yeah. So you would have your template, and you put ng repeat on the container, and then the stuff inside of it is what's going to be repeated, right? So you give it what the iterator, I guess, or the iterator object is. So instead, since React is all in JavaScript, you just give it an array of stuff. You don't have to like make connections of things. You just give it an array of components, and that's how you do it. So this part is actually one of the confusing things about React when you're getting started, because you would expect inside of the markup to like have some kind of looping construct, like if you've done ASP.NET or something like that, you would expect to be able to like have curly brackets and say for inside of there, or write some JavaScript code. You can't loop inside of it. You actually have to give it an array of things. There's no logic that you can do inside of the JSX. It's not built in that way. So we have this. I'm just going to put these on the same line so that it takes up less lines. We can kind of see the whole thing. So this is it. This is how you build lists. So actually, before I make that the definitive answer, let me make sure that it works. So it does. So it renders out of it, except we get this error, and this warning, this React warning, and it says each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. What does that mean, right? And check the render method of email list. But the nice thing is that it gives you this link to something that explains what that all means. And what it means, basically, is that on this LI, we have to give a key prop to the li, and we have to pass a unique identifier as the key. So we have the ID, that's a unique identifier. We put it on there. And the reason for it makes sense a little bit later, but the idea is that React has something called the virtual DOM, which means that as you re-render your UI, it's smart about the changes, so it only has to make the smallest amount of change to go from version A to version B. And with lists, it doesn't want to have to re-render lists over and over and over again if they haven't changed, even if they've been reordered or one thing got interleaved in the middle. So if you have an ID for the lists, it can know when it gets something new with a new ID, it knows where to put it, and it can keep the other ones there in the DOM instead of having to re-render the whole thing. So that's the reason for the key, and it needs to be unique in order for it to work properly. So I'll show cases as we move forward where that's really coming into play. So more than likely, you're going to forget to put the key, but the nice thing is that React will warn you about it, that you didn't put it. So it'll still work. Your UI will not break. It'll still render, but it'll warn you about it.
So is that only on the list elements, or is that just in general when you're mapping out your array?
Whenever you have an array of things, anything in an array, the top level component has to have key on it, or it'll warn you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what is the key for again?
So the key helps the React virtual DOM, which is like a system, like one of the core components of React. When you're re-rendering your UI over and over again, to be able to be smart about seeing what changed between version A of the list that was rendered in version B. Yeah. Question?
For whatever reason you had two lists and two separate components on the page. Do those IDs need to be unique between the lists?
No,
just
it has to be just unique within the array. So you don't have to worry about it being globally unique, just unique inside of the array. But unique across re-rendering of that same array so that it can be smart. So you wouldn't want to like put a random number in there because that's unique, but then it's going to be changing every time.
Can you use the array index as a key?
So you can use the array index as the key, and that's what people do when they first start. But that is, what's the word? Anti-pattern, because the index will change for the same element. So let's say, we have these 5 elements here, and let's say I just added one to the beginning of the array. So now, let's say I went in here and added ID 0 and added some stuff there. So the index of a little was 0. Now it'll be 1. So React thinks it's changed and it'll re-render everything instead of just saying, oh, it was 1 before, it was 1 after. Let me just insert something at the top. So it'll work, but it'll be less performant. And if you have big arrays, it'll definitely be noticeable, for sure. Yes.
If
Question?
your data set or your source doesn't provide any sort of unique identifier, what would you recommend?
So if it doesn't, it really needs to. Like, I don't know what data source, like a legitimate data source, wouldn't have it, right? So it's kind of like a fault of the data source. But if it really doesn't, then you use the index because you need something. But it'll hurt the performance of it. So sometimes you can like concatenate 2 properties of it, and those things together make it unique, or you can get pretty smart. It can be whatever. It can be any kind of number or string that you can pass to it. So you can kind of try to make it unique that way if it doesn't. Okay. So we were able to create the list that way. We have the key there. Now, just want to transform email list, kind of thinking forward about what we're going to be building, to take an email object instead of taking the individual properties. So we'll change, so instead of passing these individual parameters, we're just going to pass email to email list item. there. So we don't need all of these properties here. And I'll go ahead and shorten this syntax here. So that's like the smallest amount that it could be. And then email list item is now taking an email object. So we'll change this and say it's taking an email. So the prop type that you can use is shape. So you're saying this email property takes an object that has this shape, and the shape has from and subject in it. So that's how you basically define objects in the prop types. So this is no longer taking from and subject, it's taking email, right, and this.props, but then from and subject are inside of email, so you could do it like that, and then now you have from and subject again. So still our UI what line is that? So email list line 35, ID is not defined. It is not defined. It is email.id. There we go. So the errors in React are pretty good. They give you pretty good line numbers, and they get better and better with each version. So there's our UI again. So we passed in the email objects. So you can pass objects as props. They don't just have to be simple values like numbers and strings and booleans. You can pass whole objects in there. They suggest passing like raw objects, like object literals, not passing components and things like that. But you can pass whatever you want as properties. And oh yeah, okay. So the last thing I wanted to do is, so if we look at our app, it doesn't really look like much. When we were creating all the files, you saw those CSS files that were kind of siblings of it. So all we're really going to do is just import the CSS files that go with each component. So the way we can do that, there's a bigger styling exercise in step 10, but for now, you can just email or import email form.css. And since it's a CSS file, we basically just want to make sure it gets bundled into our app. So there's nothing to really import. There's no value that we're going to use in JavaScript. We just want to import it and do the same for the other ones. So this is email list, import email view.css there, and then import email list item.setCSS. So this is using Create React App. It's a CLI tool, like a no config CLI tool that helps you bootstrap a React app really quickly. And under the hood, it's using Webpack. And that allows you to import CSS files into the JavaScript bundle that gets created. So since we have these class names in our original markup, and I've already written some CSS for us, the app now looks like that. which doesn't seem right. I don't know where those bullets are coming from. There we go. Okay. So implicitly, when you import, it looks for JavaScript files, but you have to put the extension there. So this is what it looks like now. So it's kind of looking more like what we're building. So that you don't. This is kind of like a, if you want to look at something that looks a little nicer, you can do that step. So that's what we got. So we got these exercises here for you again. So I'll give you another 10 minutes. This one is actually like more substantive. Okay, yeah. So there's a number of things to do here. So right now, email list has this constant emails. What I would like for you to do is move this constant emails into app and pass it as a parameter to email list. Okay, so this is like emails is like our app data right now. So we need to move it into the app because other components are gonna need to use it. So that's step one. Move it into top level app, and then pass emails in app as the emails property to email list. So that's one. Then, since you're now creating an emails prop of email list. We're saying that's now the contract, the API of email list. You need to define the prop type for email list, for emails, as it says here. So declare a new emails prop type using prop types.array of an email list. And then use this.props.emails instead of emails in email list. So as you can see here, we're looping over emails. This would have to be this.props.emails because emails constant won't exist anymore when you move it. And we already did the last one of importing the component CSS. So this is just an exercise of seeing if you can make email list configurable. If you can move the emails over. So I'll give you 8:19 now. So 8 at 8:26, I'll say. So that's 7 minutes to try that exercise. I am going to continue. So I'm going to do the exercises again, like we said, but this time I'm actually going to solicit your help to see how much you've been paying attention and if any of this stuff is making sense to you. So let's see here. So I'll do the first part, I guess. So like I said, we moved the const emails out of email list, move it into app because this is now our app state or app data. And if we go to the app, it's going to be all kinds of broken, I'm sure. Yeah, of course it's broken. So how do we make this work is the question. So, and then I mentioned we want to do emails.emails. So we're passing it through there as a prop to email list. So let's at least make it work, right? So it's saying now emails is not defined on line 8. So what should be here? This props.emails. And we replace it there. We go here. Wow, okay, it works. So because we were passing emails as the prop here, attribute, prop of the component, it's now available as this.props.emails. Then we can use it there inside of render. But what I want us to also do and get in the habit of doing is always defining prop types. So it's clear what props your component takes and their types. So I gave a little hint. But let's import prop types. Okay, so we got the prop types. My little hint was that we should use prop types dot array of. But what is it an array of? So array of objects? Is that what I heard? Yeah, so it is an array of objects, but that's not really helpful because I don't know what to pass in. If I was looking at this component, I wouldn't know what form the object should be in, right? So we want to be as specific as we can. So it is an array of email objects. Well, what are email objects?
Email list item?
Prop
ID.
So they're not email list item components because it's raw data, right? So basically, I have an array
ID from
of these things.
ID from object.
So
ID from subject.
yeah, so if you remember, we made this over here, right? We said a single email is prop types dot shape of from and subject. So we can use the same definition here. So you can say it's an array of shape of this, of from and subject. And I guess technically ID too. So, yes, question.
Well, I guess I was gonna ask, are you essentially starting to use like this class of email?
Mm-hmm.
When we say shape, we're sort of referencing a pseudo class of ours.
Well, it's kind of like one. It's like maybe closer to an interface, maybe, than a class, but you're not going to ever do anything with it. It's not going to have any methods on it. So it's really more a prop type than a class. But yeah, it's kind of the same spirit.
Or like a struct, maybe?
Yeah, yeah, it's like a struct. But then again, it's not. This is a definition of that struct, not a struct itself. So, but yeah, right.
Why not use prop types dot object?
So instead of shape,
Yeah.
doing prop types dot object, you can. So, but prop type dot object is not helpful. It'll pass, so you won't get the warning, but it's not helpful to anybody. Like, it doesn't really take any kind of object, right? If I pass to something else, it will fail because it'll try to get email.id from it and such. So yeah, and actually people set up linting rules that prevent you from doing prop types at object because it's basically lazy in the end and it's not helpful. So we can create a constants file here and import prop types here and then export const email prop type. Because we have email list item using this prop type. We have email list using this prop type. We want to make sure they stay consistent. So the way to make them stay consistent is to use the same prop type. So we define it here in the constants file, export const email prop type. Then we can import it like email prop type from constants. So because I didn't do export default, I did export const, the name thing. It's a named export. So then I can use a named import by putting it in curly braces.
Is there a reason ID is not part of that?
Yeah, so ID should be, right? So ID is a number. So let's add ID to it. So that would be prop types dot, any guesses?
Number?
Number, yeah. And it should be required too. There you go. So, yes, question.
So I was wondering, is there some way to like reference one? Because obviously we have the original prop type that we did was from subject, and this is just extending it with an ID. Is there a way to do that with these, or do they need to be in their own separate ones?
You mean like if you had the other one, you wanted to add a new one to it, or?
Well, yeah, we kind of have like two types of emails. We have the one with the ID and the one without. So is there a way to reference the one without the ID inside of this, so that just like to reduce redundancy?
Well, actually, what happened is that we just needed the definition to have ID. We just missed that as part of the definition of it. So, but if you did, but like your general question is, can you have, if you had cases where you had one part and then you had something that contained that other part,
Or just like extended it.
So it would, I'm trying to think of a use case where you would have an object. Usually you would have nesting in that case, I would think. So like if you had, I don't know what an object would be, but let's say we had some object that had a name, and then email with ID, one, subject, and so forth, right? Subject. Then you could create a prop type that was thing prop type, let's call it. That is prop types dot shape. So it takes a name that is a string. We'll say that's optional, and then it takes email, which is email prop type. So if they're nested, you could do it that way. But if it's like an extension of it, I'm not sure. I don't think that's possible with the prop types. You know. You have a question?
Yeah, that casing convention you're using for prop types, is that just for prop types or is it more general in React?
Oh yeah. So generally in JavaScript, or I guess I'll just say specifically React. I don't want to blanket it. Is constants are capital snake case, just to differentiate themselves with other things. Yeah. Oh, so I think to solve what you're saying, a way you could solve it is you would have to create a variable that was this const. Man, I can't think of words right now. Let's call it const email shape. So it would be that, and then if you wanted to create a new thing that had shape with it, you would create const email, or I'll call it with email shape, and then there's this thing called the spread operator, and you would say name prop types dot shape. So the spread operator is like object dot assign, or assign in underscore or low dash if you use that, maybe. But basically it takes all the stuff that was in here, puts it into the object, and then adds in name to it, and then you would create a shape with that. So you would have to do some splitting out to make that possible. It's a good question. I've never had that happen though, so. Let's back out all of that. I'll keep all of it, and then just comment it all out. So we had export const this prop types dot shape that. That and all this stuff. Let's comment it out. Okay, so we're using email prop type here, an email list item there, and then an email list will also import email prop type from constants. Then we can just say array of email prop types. Okay. I think that was the totality of the exercise. I swear I saved. Oh. Okay. That should do it. Okay. Then I have a whole bunch of prop types that I never used. Never used that one. Okay, so now let's go ahead and move on to the next thing, email view. So this is where we really start building interactivity. That's what I was talking about. So like if we can understand and get this, we're going to be handling user events now. We're going to be storing some state to know what's selected and not selected. But like this is basically it. So up until now, we've just been rendering a static UI. So like, I mean, it's nice and fine, but that's not what applications are. You got to respond to user interactions. So let's do that. So what we want basically is when the user clicks on one of these emails, that it actually shows the details in place of view selected email. So we click on one of these things, it shows it. That's what we want to build. Okay? So let's do that. So the first thing we're going to do is add an on-click handler to the email list item. So we're here in email list item. We'll just add an on-click here. And we're going to call a method that we're going to define on the class. So I'll just call this handle click. Ooh, this looks horrendous in this big font. So let me put these on separate lines so you can see what's going on. Okay, so on click, we're going to call this method handle click that I'll define now. So we have this bind thing here. So on click, we're passing a function to it. I'm going to get rid of these. We don't need these anymore. So we can move this higher. Okay, so we're passing a function to onClick, but when onClick gets called, the function we pass to it, we want to make sure that it has the proper this context when it's called. So we actually have to give it a function that has this bound to it. So that's why we have that bind this. There are ways to get around that, which I don't want to get into because that's just a tangent on what we're doing. But the thing I want to point out is that the way that you add event handlers to elements is that you just pass those attributes to it. So you just pass on click to it. If you wanted on mouse over, then you would just pass on mouse over to it. So it's pretty straightforward, actually. It's kind of like old school JavaScript. So now, if I go console.log here, when the click happens, I should, and I'll come back to the code in a second, should get events there. And the thing is, these events are called synthetic events. So they're not the actual DOM event. It's React wrapping the DOM event in basically a cross-browser compatible way, so that you can always call the same method on it, no matter what browser you're on. Because events in IE are different than events in Chrome, are different than events in Edge, for instance. So it kind of normalizes all the differences between them, so it's easy to use. Okay, so now we have the event here. We can now want to basically create a new API for our email list item. Essentially what we want to do is tell the parent component, hey, I was clicked. And you want to tell the parent component you were clicked with the ID that you were clicked with. So in here, so we'll add a new prop. We'll call it onSelect, let's say. And this is prop types.function. So I actually have to go back and add the prop types that I removed. So since onSelect is not required, I have to check. Let's get email and onSelect from this.props. So now we're not in render, we're in this method that we created. And we'll say if onSelect is defined. So if someone called my email list item with an onSelect function, then I'm going to pass email, I'm going to pass my ID to it. So this will make sense as we get to the top, to app. We basically want the app to know that this email list item has been clicked. That's ultimately what we're trying to do in terms of the implementation. But email list item is in between an email list component, because app only knows about email list. So we have to create a way that we can pass the information up to the component. So let me take a step back. So if you look at app, it has email list, email view, and email form. And it passes data down this kind of component element hierarchy. So it passes the emails to email list, and then email list, close this. Email list creates a bunch of email list items and passes email down to it. And then finally, email list item renders its UI. So basically, it's very top down. But what happens if the top wants to know something that happened at the bottom? You do that by passing functions. The top to bottom passes functions that get handled. So hopefully it'll be more clear as we kind of build this out. So we have this onSelect property that we define, this prop. And when it's called, we pass email.id. So then the email list item can now handle an onSelect function. It can now pass onSelect to the email list item. But it doesn't really want to do anything. It just wants to let the app know that something happened, because ultimately the app wants to do some action when the individual email list items have been clicked. So what we can do is create a prop called onItemSelect. We'll name that thing, make that thing a function. And then we can pass this.props that on item select. I'll put these on separate lines. To it. So all email list does is just pass the function that it received as on item select to the on select of email list item. And then once again, when this thing is clicked, it'll call on select with the email ID. Okay? So we can just do that part, and then hopefully this last part will make sense. So now email list can pass on item select. Let me go ahead and pick these. Format it nicely. So now we can pass something to on item select. And what we can pass is a handler. So let's have a function that's called handle item select, let's say. And that is what we'll pass to on item select. Okay, let me scroll this up. Okay, so let's walk this through from the top now down to the bottom. So we have email list that has an on item select prop that's a function. Okay, and we pass it a reference to our method here. That reference to a function, that function we pass to email list. Email list has that as on item select, like we said, and it just passes it to all of the email list items. Because it has on select, it pass this dot props dot on select. All right.
Do the dot bind for that?
No, you don't, because you're not trying to reference a method here. You're basically just passing whatever function. You're just kind of passing it down. You don't have to do dot bind this in that case. And then now you're at email list item. Email list item gets on select as you've defined. You click something, you call handle click, and then handle click will actually call that function reference that was called. So that this on select here is actually a reference to handle item select. And that's how you're able, the app is actually able to say, hey, when an item is clicked, I want to be notified. So then in the end, you have the email ID right there. So let's see. I'll test it out and then we can talk about it. Okay, so now in theory, we'll throw a lot of errors. So, what did I do wrong? Let's work through everything that I did wrong. Okay, so it says it says email list, handle click. It's trying to read a property of email. So, let's see what I did. What we did.
It's like 14 GB props.
Yeah, there you go. That should be props. Let's click it again. Okay, now we got the ID. So ultimately, you want app to know what item is selected. So and this is how we built it. And the reason why we want app to know what is selected is because we want to keep that in. We want to know what that is so that we can then pass the selected email. Pass the selected email to email view. Ultimately, we want email view to get the selected email. Like that's the whole exercise and what we're trying to do. we want email view to know the selected email, but the selection happens way down in email list item. And email view and email list item cannot talk to each other. So you have app at the top, you have email list, has a whole bunch of email list items. Then over here, you have email view. And how do you have the email list item talk to the email view? Like that's the exercise and what we're trying to do. And in React, there's no way for them to talk. Like there's no like global messaging bus that you can pass messages to some global radio and then email views listening to it happening. Like none of that happens in React. They want everything to be predictable in how data passes through. Yes.
Does, like in this case, the ID went all the way to the top parent?
Yeah.
Is it always that case? Like, do you recommend going like, data moving all the way to the top and then back down?
So what they say is that you have to go as far up into a shared parent, to the shared parent, basically. So if email view was a child of email list for some weird reason, then you would only have to go up to email list to get that data. But you have to go to a shared parent. So the shared parent between the list items and the email view is the app. So you have to go all the way to the app. But this concept of like passing functions down so that the parent can know that something happened is like kind of core to how React works. It's basically how communication can happen because you can't have global communication in React. There are ancillary libraries that make that possible and stuff like Redux and such, but just in React, it's not possible.
So you cannot do like an add event listener?
No. So you can, I should say, yes, you can, but you shouldn't, because that breaks out of React's world. So in theory, like in the email view, I almost don't want to tell you that you can do this. But let's say you added an ID here and you called it email list item plus ID. So it's unique, right? Then an email view, in a special method called component did mount, which we would talk about later. But this is when the component has actually been rendered in the DOM. You know the DOM exists. You could do document .get element by ID email list item 3, for instance. You could do that, but you shouldn't. Like you absolutely shouldn't, because then you're just breaking out of what React can keep track of and how it all works. You basically do this stuff if you had to like talk to jQuery or something that was inherently not part of React. But like this is like when I was first doing React, this is like what I wanted to do because this is what I was used to and this is how it was supposed to work. But don't do it. Pretend I never told you that. So we have this email list item. We pass the data. So I should say, like, the reason you asked that and the reason I wanted to do that is that passing those functions all the way down the tree felt verbose. It felt like a lot of work. It felt like I had to write a lot of stuff. But it's very clear what's happening, though. You can see that the app is passing this function to the email list that's passing this function to the email list item. So when debugging happens, and which is where the problems arise, like you can know where things broke down instead of having this global thing like email view listening to email list item and communicating and setting other things. Like when that was the problem with some of the other frameworks is that there was no authority and different things could talk to different things and communicate different ways. And you had no idea who set the data and when and how. So React inherently is more verbose because it tries to be more predictable in how things are passed around the tree. Okay, so that was kind of about function passing. That's how the top can know what's happening in the bottom by passing functions down. Then I want to introduce So ultimately, like I said, we want email view to get the selected email. Like that's what we want it to have. So we now need to somehow pass it the selected email. So what we do is the app maintains this thing called state, this property called state. So it has this property called props that's like inherent to it, but you can also define state for a component. So it can keep state over time, basically. So dynamic information. And this state that I want to keep is called selected email ID. And I'll default it to -1 to mean nothing is selected. So we have this state, it's selected email ID, and then with selected email ID, what we could do is try to find the selected email in render. So we're starting to like build some logic in our render. So I have emails. I want to find inside of emails the selected one. So I'll say email and then return. It's true, it's been found if email.id equals this.state that's selected email ID. I would actually do this. So now selected email should be if an email ID was in the state, should be the selected one. And then I could pass email that to email view. Okay. But we actually need to figure out a way when I click in the email list item and that gets passed up to email list as on item select, gets passed up to the app because I passed this on item select and gets passed to handle item select. I have this email ID right here, the one that actually was selected. So I need to put it in the state. And the way that you do that is this dot set state. And I set it to be selected email ID. Email ID. Okay. So that's how you update the state. And that's how the state changing over time and having your render be based upon the state is how your UI changes over time, basically. That way. So if I go to the app here and I open up the React DevTools here, you can see my state is there. And as I click stuff, the state is changing. Okay, so we're getting there. Like we're building the building blocks. We don't have it yet, but we're getting there. And you would also see it right there because we still are logging it. Okay, so we've almost got the pieces together. So we now know when that something is clicked. We're putting it into state. Okay, we're now rendering or getting the selected email. So let's we can actually log that out to make sure we're doing that correctly. Selected email. So when we click, we're actually getting that selected email, right? So it feels very, what's the word? Very indirect, basically, how we're doing it. but we're getting that email. We're passing it to email view. So let's pretend for a second email view knew how to handle email, right? So a user interaction happened. Effectively, we updated the state of app, and then what happens whenever you set state, React will call render again. That's why we're able to get this console.log. So instead of, like normally when you had a user action happen, you would manually go and update the UI yourself, however you see fit. So you would do your add event listener, and then using jQuery, you would set HTML to whatever, or you would change the class of whatever. But instead, in React, what you do is when a user interaction happens, you update some state. And as a result of updating state, it calls render again. And since your render is should be based upon the value of the state, your UI will update. And then changes happen that way. So your React UI is always a function or always based upon state and props, basically. Always state and props. The props are given to you by your parent, and their state is what you control yourself and change as a component. So the state changing is how the UI updates. So then visually, let's just see this work. So in the email view, we can, I'll copy this and explain what's going on. So now I am getting out the email prop. Let me make this less ES6 crazy. Okay, so we're getting the email from props, and then we're getting subject from date and message. Those are new things that we're going to get. Actually, where did we get email? Message. I guess I'll add that in a second. So we're getting message and such, and then we're rendering it out. Okay, so now email view is smarter. It actually, given an email, will actually render out information about the email. It'll render the subject. It'll render the from with the mail to a tag around it. It'll render the date if it had one, and it'll render the message. So now undefined. Now I have to do one last thing. So the problem is that we're passing selected email when it's undefined. So email view is getting an undefined email in the beginning because selected ID is -1. So let's just set it to 1 so we can at least see this thing working. So now I click things and things update. Finally. What'd you say? Oh, I got the render for from here, from here. Okay, so now let's walk all the way through it. I'll walk backwards this time. So email view takes an email prop and can render information about the email. And I'll explain this dangerously set inner HTML in a bit, because it's dangerous. So this is already what we already know what to do. Like we already know how to get a prop and render stuff about it. Now the app, whenever it has state, that is the selected email ID. Whenever a user action happens, it ultimately, when we click, it'll call handle item select with the email ID there. And we set state. We don't try to update the UI ourselves. When the action happens, we set state. And then when we set state, React will call render again. And now the state has changed. The selected email ID is different. We get a new selected email and we pass it to email view. And now it renders out something new. So that's how it happens in this kind of cyclical loop. Yeah.
So return email ID equals selected email ID. Isn't it supposed to return just the ID, or how come it's returning the whole?
Okay, so this is how find works. So find, you pass it a function, and whenever the function returns true, that's the object you want it to give you.
Got it.
So this is another one of my special ligatures. So that's triple equals.
Okay.
It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, I guess. Oh, it has 3 lines. You didn't even notice that. Yeah. So it has 3 lines there to show you it's triple equals. Double equals looks bigger. So yeah, that's how find works basically. It gives you that one. So
Wait, sorry. It's returning an ID.
so find is returning true, basically.
Right.
So when it's true, then it'll give you back the email for that one. So it goes through everyone,
Gotcha.
return true,
Gotcha.
gives you that. And that's how the email view changes. So if we look at it though, so from the standpoint of the code, it looks like every time the state changes, we are re-rendering the whole UI, right? Because we're calling render again. So it's re-rendering main, it's re-rendering email list, it's re-rendering email view, and it's re-rendering email form. That's what it looks like because it's calling render again. But what actually happens is that it only changes the things that changed. So let me pull up the elements view here. So I'll open up this li here, and then here is our email view with some content. So we can watch what happens on the right whenever I click on something. So I click on this, and the only thing that changes is the content of the H1 and the content of the A tag. Even though it looked like it was rendering everything. And that's the virtual DOM, that's the reconciler. It figures out that nothing changed between before and after, so it only updates the content that changed. So it makes it a lot easier to create UI, in my opinion, because you don't have to worry about like micro changes, like, oh, when I do this, then I have to update only this little piece. It's much simpler to say, hey, this is my UI, this is how it works when with these configurations. Oh, just update those configurations and see what happens. So it ends up becoming a lot easier. You don't have to try to optimize yourself. You just let React optimize. The only thing that you lose, or the only difficulty I would say, is that you have to do this indirection. You always set state as a result of a user action. You don't update the UI yourself. Yes.
How would you handle that bit about the UI starting with a -1?
Oh yeah, so I was going to get to that. I'll get to that unless anybody else has other questions about what we talked about so far. Then I'll answer that question for sure. Any other questions about how this is working / blowing your mind?
I guess I just want to be clear that calling set state is what's going to call render again?
Yes. It calls render with the new value of state.
Correct. And do you say there are more properties in state? Do you necessarily have to, whenever you call set state, do you necessarily have to update all?
So you can set state with just whatever you want to change, and then it'll merge that into the current value of state, and then call render again. So you don't have to worry about passing all the previous versions of state or anything like that.
And you can add properties on the fly.
To state, you can, but it's best to like declare state with the default values, so it's clear what is in your state. But you could add stuff to state. But then the first time, that value would be undefined, so you'd have to make sure that you handle that properly. But you could. It's just a plain object in the end. Yes.
If you were to set the state to the same value that already existed, would it actually call render again? Like, does it look for changes on the state object, or does it?
Okay, so that question is the reason for a pure component. So, so there is this. So what he asks is that if you like did this dot set state dot this dot state, I guess. So if you set state to the current value of state, would it actually call render again? So there are ways to optimize whether or not render should be called. And what pure component does is it just looks at the different properties inside state and says, is this reference the same as the reference it was before? If it's the same, then it won't call render again. So if you call this dot state there, all the references should be the same, so it wouldn't call render again. But if you had like objects in there and then you had created copies of the objects, even though the objects were the exact same, it would still call render because their references are different. So pure component would ultimately render again. Component just does deep evaluations of everything. So so it will be able to. So it ends up doing more work to figure out whether or not it needs to render or not. So basically, pure component versus component, the difference is that it tries to optimize how many times it has to call render. And if you're never mutating your state by basically like doing this dot state dot selected email ID, like you should never ever do this, like directly mutate state, because then, well, one, it will never call render if you did this, but two, it kind of doesn't allow pure component to figure out the differences in order to call render.
With the set state, would it be possible? Would there ever be a scenario where set state gets called, render gets called, but then state gets altered within that render?
Okay.
And then it's kind of like a loop until it's not state.
Yeah. So you can, based upon what your question is, you can never call set state in render. Like React will actually tell you can't call set state in render. If it sees you doing it, it'll warn you. It might even error. I guess we could see.
Well, what I meant was you call set state,
Mm-hmm.
and then then render gets called,
Mm-hmm.
and then state is altered again within that render, so it kind of keeps looping until a state is stable.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that is not possible.
Oh,
it doesn't allow you to do that. If it catches you doing that, it'll throw a warning.
Gotcha.
Like when you're rendering, whether it's this component, some other component, or whatever, you can never call set state, because you'll get in that case that you're talking about, and it breaks it up. So render should only be rendering your UI based upon the current value of state and your props, basically.
I'm sorry, what are we calling set state?
We're calling set state here and handle item select
Okay.
as a result of clicking.
So there's there's no polling to see if changes are happening, or some kind of watch?
To watch on what?
The state. Like in Angular, there's a watch on
Oh, like observables?
Yeah, that are checking to see if there's changes that happen.
Yeah.
New value and old value.
Yeah. So that's a different approach. And there are pros and cons of that. So like I said, React is always trying to be explicit about what's happening. So you set it, you're saying set state, and then it happens as a result. There are other libraries, like the two main libraries of maintaining state in React are mobx and Redux. Mobx lets you mutate your state, like you just change it, and it has the observables that's listening to it. And when the state changes, then it does something. Whereas Redux is different. So that's just not the way React works. You have to specifically set it.
So in this case, we're just checking state when we click. So on the click event.
Yeah, on the click event, we bubble it up to the app, like I mentioned before, and then ultimately it's handle item select, and we're setting state as a result of it.
And that was the perspective I was coming from Angular with the washers.
Okay.
It was sort of like that digester.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if that wouldn't happen with set state.
No, it's not watching. You tell it, basically. Yeah. Okay. So to answer your question about how do we handle that case? Because when we start off, selected email is going to be undefined because it won't be found. And we're going to get this error that says that it couldn't find it. Because ultimately we're passing undefined to email. And actually if I had prop types set up, it would have told me that. But that's why you have prop types. So the way that you can do it is is you can conditionally render components. So this is like the last portion of this section. So we only want to render the email view if we have a selected email, basically. So what we can do is declare a component or a variable called email view. And that is actually what we'll render here. Then we'll say if selected email exists, because it was found, email view equals our component. Doesn't like.
Just like before we had the consts. Let email view there.
It doesn't like this? Yes, this isn't render. This should work, I think. Oh, okay. So now email view is hidden. Like there's nothing being rendered. So we can actually prove that by going to React. Let's say I collapse this. So all we're rendering now is email list and email form. Then I click on something. And now email view shows up. And it's there. And it's in there. And then it has the different values. But if I go into app and say, hey, you should be -1. Oh, yeah. So the DevTools lets you play with your state so you can test stuff. So I can set it to -1, and then it goes away again. So basically, that's how you're going to end up conditionally rendering a lot of components that way. It's like there's no more display nunning of things or that sort of thing, or like add a hide class to stuff. You just don't render it. And because React is so optimized, you can just render it or not render it. That's how it works. Yeah.
Do the React DevTools only let you set state if you're running from localhost, or does it? I mean, could I?
Yeah, you could mess with anybody's React app. It's just they're going to be obfuscated, so you won't know what that state controls. But or maybe the DevTools only let you do it if it's in dev mode. I've never tried it because your React app gets compiled in production mode versus dev mode. So maybe it don't let you do it in dev mode. That would be the smart thing for the tool. But yeah. I've never tried it. Never tried hack Facebook.
I have a question about
So what I'm saying is,
I have a question
if
about
an email,
that error that some of us keep getting
Yeah.
about, I guess, sort of logic or variables outside of the render.
hmm
Why is it that you can write methods but not variables?
Yeah. So the thing I kept showing and that you just ran into back there is, yeah, you can't define a local variable
Oh,
here because that doesn't really make sense in this context of a class. You could have a an instance property called here, but you can't declare a local variable called here because you need to be in the context of a function for that to happen. So, yeah. Okay, let's scroll down. So, yeah, this is conditionally rendering. It's basically, so with React, if you have a variable, it can render, if you give it undefined or null, it just won't render anything. And then you can have a variable be a component, and then it'll render that component. So, conditionally rendering there. So, that's key. I guess I'll tell you, this is the format I do. So I do it like this. I try not to have logic inside of the actual JSX, but you will see many times, instead of doing it this way, you'll see selected email and email view. So you'll see something like that instead. So they're saying if selected emails is undefined, then it'll just render undefined. But if it's actually a valid value, then it'll render email. So that is very prevalent. It's still an expression, so that works totally fine. But if email view had a ton of props or what have you, can get pretty crazy with these things. But one or the other. But I think this one ends up making your JSX more cleaner. So let's see. I think that was everything. Oh yes, so I need to explain the dangerously set HTML part. So let's say, then we'll be in a good place. Oops. So I'm going to update emails at constant to have more data in it. So now we have date and message has some markup inside of it. So now when we render, we can see the markup in there. One of them had it. This one. You can see like this is an ordered list inside of there. Okay, so React by default is safe. So if instead of this div, I had div message, and I just rendered out the message directly, it'll actually encode the HTML. So I'll just get HTML in there, which would be sad, right? So what I want to tell it is basically give me like the unencoded version. I want to take my code and set it directly as the HTML, the inner HTML of this element. So the way that you do that is you live dangerously. You have to set the dangerously set HTML property, but not only that, you have to put your string in an object that has the property __ HTML. So you have to like go through two hoops basically to make sure you really want to set this thing as the raw message that way. So now when you set it this way, it will not encode it. It'll go past the encoding and just set the value there.
That's really the attribute?
That's really the attribute. Yep. Dangerously set in HTML. Because, I mean, it opens you all to kind of cross-site scripting attacks and stuff like that. So you have to make sure that that code is safe. Oh, yeah.
Is there a way to, I'm sorry if you already went over this, it's not like coming in a little late, but is there a way to encode that without having it be dangerous in that context? Like, can you render it still in a, maybe through a filter, a markup language of some sort that's considered safe?
So you mean like, so not have it encoded or have the string encoded before you actually put it inside of the content? Yeah, so if you wanted to do that, then you would have to use some kind of library that would encode it for you or turn it into the markup. Yeah. But basically, that's how you end up setting raw HTML. I do this every once in a while, but usually I want the encoding, and it's encoded by default, so you kind of are less likely to have any kind of attacks or vulnerabilities that way. So what other questions can I answer about this? We kind of covered kind of like three main topics. It was the passing of functions down to get data to the top. The main one of maintaining state, like that's how you build interactivity by calling set state and re-rendering. And then this, then the conditionally rendering components. So any of those three. Yeah.
I'm sorry, something.
Oh, but anything else? Anything's fine. Yeah.
So you mentioned Redux.
Mhm.
You talked a bit about MobX.
MobX, yeah.
Okay. Could you, I don't know, just briefly, like, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah. So so we maintained state in state, right? And that's fine. And I think when people learn React, they should just do that, and you can build all kinds of great applications with that. But when things get big and you want to have different components maintaining state or talking to the application state, Redux and MobX are good solutions for that. So I forgot who asked the question about container component, but I think it was maybe you. But app right now is our container component because it has the app state. So the main difference between MobX and Redux is Redux works much like set state. Whenever you want to change the state, you create a new object of the state and then update that object. So it's based upon this concept of reducers, and you have actions that tell the reducers to return new values of the state. So many times you're just copying the state, and as a result of the state changing that way explicitly, your UI will update. Whereas MobX has mutations. You actually mutate the state. Something's listening to that mutation, and then that's how your UI updates. So, or that's how it dispatches that a change happened. So it's the main difference is basically how the state updates, how you do it. I've used Redux mainly, so not MobX. Yes. Question.
Would you say that the container components always have a state and the presentation components don't carry state?
Yeah. Yeah. Application state, I should say. So you can use state to also like keep track of things that are happening in your UI, like whether this thing is visible or not, or whether you're focused or not. Like those are related to the UI, not the application state or data. So
application state, you mean like managing the data?
Yeah, basically like the data that you got from the server or that sort of thing. That's where the container components come in. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious, is there like a style guide for how you would think about your React apps? Like in AngularJS, there's the Papa style way of doing things. Is there like a best practices way of structuring everything?
So the answer is no, unfortunately. There's kind of, because React was basically like they want people to be able to do it kind of how you want to do it. But like that doesn't fly when you're at a company and everybody's doing it very differently. So you have like maybe this project that's on React will have a style guide, or at Eventbrite we actually have a style guide. So I'll show you that since you're all here listening to me. So you go to GitHub Eventbrite /JavaScript, and we came up with a style guide because we had all of these people joining our team, and we're learning React, and we needed to have a way of making things consistent. So we have a React and JSX coding style guide. So it talks about how do you do components, component prop types, like how to maintain state, what you should do in render, like all of these different things we talk about. So if you're interested, you can look at that as a starting point. Yeah.
Not enough time to explain life cycle methods.
Life cycle methods would be the next steps that we would talk about and what to do with those. So basically, what life cycle methods are is that you want to be able to hook into like doing things before render, maybe after render, before your component gets destroyed, like those type of things. So there's a lifecycle method called component did mount. That's the main one that you would use. So that's when your UI has actually been rendered to the DOM, and you know the DOM exists. So you would make API calls then. You could, if you needed to, for some reason, like if you had a jQuery plugin, connect that to your React DOM if you needed to. Like those sort of things happen in component did mount. Yeah.
I guess sort of from an architecture point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking like when you're deciding what framework to use to build a new application, when would you want to use React? What are the characteristics of this new app of yours that like, you know what, this is what the app's going to do. This is sort of how I want to architect it. This is how I want components to relate to each other. I should definitely use React for this. How would you know that?
So my thinking is that you should use what you're comfortable with. Like all of these libraries all are very good at building user interfaces. That's why they exist and they're popular. So it's less about, if I'm going to build this type of thing, or if it's small, or if it's big, or it's that, use React. Like I personally use React for everything because that's what I'm comfortable with, and I could build it really quickly with it. So if you're very familiar with Angular 1, use Angular 1. If you're very familiar with Angular 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, use that instead. If you're familiar with Ember or Vue, like, so what was that?
Not done.
Oh, no, don't use Knockout. No, don't use Knockout or Backbone. Okay. But all the other ones, the modern ones, I'd say just use whatever you're comfortable with, and whatever the team's comfortable with. So I don't think they're all capable of building the things. Like I have personal biases against some or for some and things like that. Like I prefer the libraries that basically don't separate the templating from the logic, and they're all in the same file, like React is. That's a personal bias towards those, but all of them are totally possible.
So I'm sort of thinking like, is it awkward to build a component and really it's just a small app and you're going to use it maybe once?
For React?
Yeah.
Well, everything is a component, so it's not like you're building a shared thing. You're just, like, you could build everything in your app.js file, and that's totally fine. If it's really, really small, it works. Yes.
So you're routing to different pages.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say to make those pages different container components? Would that be an easy thing?
Yeah. So there's a library called React Router that makes that really simple. So what you end up doing is you have this shell, and that shell can maybe have your header or your left nav or whatever is in it. And it basically just renders a prop that it's given called children. And then each one of your routes is a container component. You could call it a page or call it a screen or whatever. And then depending on your route, React Router will pass that shell component the page to render. and that would be a container component that each talk to the data.
So in terms of like sharing or like passing, they don't have a parent at that level, right?
Yeah, they have technically they have the shell, but they don't have really the shell, and that don't really talk to each route. Don't talk that much. So at that point, it's really helpful to have something like Redux. It's a store that contains that data, so that each of the pages can talk to it. Yeah. So before we wrap up, so the exercise for this was to actually create a close button inside of the email view that will actually close itself instead of having to manipulate that. So for any of you that are interested, definitely when we wrap up, you can try that out, and I can chat with anybody who stays about what it takes to do that. But the hint is to add an on-close prop to email view. That will also update the state. So we have that there. So we're basically at time. I actually have no idea when this was supposed to end. Someone said 9:30, someone said 10. It was like, as long as people are here, and I was like, that's kind of mean. Yeah, just to wrap up. So we kind of went on some of these things. So there's more to what we just talked about. Like, we've covered the bases. So as I assumed, we would get to step 4, and like learning about reactivity is key, and conditional rendering is very key, and event handling. Those are like the basics in addition to JSX. The further steps, so you can continue on with the steps in the GitHub repo if you want, and go throughout the rest of them. It's kind of in the same format. You won't have me talking to you, but you can still try at it and do the exercises, and ping me if you run into any questions. But if you're, in addition to React is just a view layer. So a lot of people have Redux, or MobX I should add in there, to maintain their state in a separate global place, so that multiple components can easily talk to it instead of having like a God component at the top that knows everything. There's testing. There's a library called Enzyme that makes it easy to test your React components, which is pretty cool. Since React is not actually touching the DOM, you're creating components. It makes it really easy to test what they render. And then we talked about routing with React Router. You can have animations as well, form validation, server rendering, like all that's possible with React, and more functionality than what the workshop could go into, but there are all kinds of cool things. And that's it. That's all I got for you. Thank you very much for staying with me and listening. Yeah, so feel free to have an AMA. You can ask me anything there. Ping me.
You said that the test was